So I'll start with just a few comments on China's role in the world economy and how we think that has been evolving very, very quickly here of late, particularly as the global financial and economic crisis has evolved, with China playing a very, very big role in the crisis and particularly in the potential policy responses to it. The structural facts are by now well known in terms of China's critical role in the world economy. It's either the second largest economy in the world, if you use purchasing power parity exchange rates, or about to become the third largest if you use market exchange rates. It's, of course, been the world's fastest growing economy for 30 years. Indeed, in recent years, China by itself has been contributing more to global economic growth than anybody else. Its growth rate is now a little less than 10%, but up until recently, it was easy to think of China accounting for 10% of the world economy, growing at 10%, and thereby contributing 1 full percentage point to global growth, with global growth now at 4% or less, maybe even this year 3% or less. That's very close to accounting for a quarter to a third of world growth all by itself, considerably more than the United States, of course, as the U.S. has slowed sharply with the current crisis. China is the world's second largest exporter, by far the largest trade and current account surplus country, with foreign currency reserves not only the largest in the world, approaching $2 trillion, but about twice that of Japan, the next largest on that category. China, of course, has also become the world's largest polluter, which adds significantly to its impact on the environmental issues, and its energy demand per unit of output is about 3 to 5 times as great as that of Europe or even the United States, suggesting why the shift to China's central role in global growth has added substantially to total global demand for primary products and thereby pushed up prices for a long time until the recent reversal, and suggesting that that might resume in the future. In any event, it is clear that China has become a global economic superpower. It is one of only 3 global economic superpowers, along with the United States and the European Union. You have to meet 3 criteria to be a global superpower. You've got to be big, you've got to be dynamic, and you've got to be quite open to the world economy, which China, of course, is. China's trade to GDP ratios are over 60%, double that of the United States, triple that of Japan. It's a very open country, despite continuing problems with some trade barriers there. I say China is one of 3 global economic superpowers, but in thinking operationally, the European Union, while an economic superpower, of course, does not speak with a single voice on many issues: fiscal issues, financial regulatory issues, topics that have become central to the crisis. So of the 3, only the United States and China are really, in a sense, to a significant sense, unitary actors who can act decisively and comprehensively on global economic issues in a way that is needed in particular in responding to a crisis of the type that we have today. China thus raises challenges, the topic of our book, for the global system simply by virtue of its size and its rapid increase. That, of course, means, too, that it bears substantial responsibilities for the global system. When you're big, you're powerful, you play a big role in affairs, responsibility goes with the territory. And that, of course, has become true for China as well. It is up to China to play a role commensurate with its increased clout. However, we note in the book that for China to adopt the responsible leadership role in the world economy that its substantive position requires, itself faces enormous challenges, because China contains 3 unique characteristics in terms of all historical precedents for a global economic superpower. First, it's still a poor country. Its per capita income, again, depending how you calculate it, is still only 5 to 10% that of the United States, Europe, the other rich industrial countries. It's indeed the first poor economic superpower that the world has ever experienced. Second, it is still not yet a fully marketized economy. It's made great progress in that direction. It's gone a long way. I think it intends to continue down that road, but it is still not yet fully marketized, and that distinguishes it from the other economic superpowers. And third, the politics, of course. It is certainly not a democracy yet. And again, this is the first global economic superpower in history that has not been democratic. So on three important counts, China raises unique challenges not only by virtue of its size, but by virtue of its characteristics, and therefore poses an overarching question, which we pose in the book and which is posed to the world. Will China be able to assume a responsible leadership role in the global economic order, especially in the current crisis? Will it be able to help lead the kind of global recovery that is needed and restructure the global economic system in a way that will head off future problems of this type? Or, the polar opposite, will it decide to go its own way, do beggar thy neighbor kinds of steps, undertake negative policies like the United States did in the 1930s with the Smoot-Hawley tariff and other decidedly antisocial steps? In other words, big countries can go off the rails. Would China be a risk of going in that direction rather than in pursuing the constructive leadership role that was necessary on structural evolution terms anyway, but is particularly critical in the current environment? The evidence to date, I think one would have to say, and we say this in the book, is mixed. That was true prior to the crisis, but it is also true since the crisis broke out. Before the crisis broke, there was a number of test cases, one might say, as to whether China was playing the role in a constructive global economic posture that would be desired and indeed necessary. In terms of the global monetary system, we know that China for several years had been intervening massively in the currency markets to keep its currency undervalued. That had been an important driver of the dramatic rise in its external surpluses, which had exceeded 10% of GDP over the last couple of years, an unprecedented level of external surplus for such a big trading and economic power. That was not all due, certainly, to the exchange rate, but it was certainly intensified by the exchange rate being undervalued, which in turn was a direct result of China's massive intervention. And that, in turn, is a direct violation of the international rules of the game. Countries are not permitted under the IMF rules to intervene in that way in the currency markets to keep their currencies far from equilibrium levels. Now, I don't suggest the IMF has been very vigilant or very effective in policing those rules in former cases. There have been a few where it did, but not in some where it should have. Nevertheless, China, as such a huge and important player in the global system, is certainly not conducting its policies in consonance with global international norms when it pursues that kind of effort. Likewise, and it might be noted, and should be noted, that the big imbalances, the China surpluses as well as the U.S. deficits, were a causal factor of the current crisis. The big imbalances meant that the U.S. was importing huge amounts of capital. That increased the level of liquidity in our economy. It kept our interest rates lower than otherwise the case. That didn't force us, to be sure, to conduct over-leveraging of the type we have, make lousy mortgage loans and all the rest that brought on the crisis. But it certainly created an environment that were conducive to that kind of behavior, provided incentives to do so, and therefore are part of the landscape that underlay the current problem. I certainly don't blame China or Japan or the Gulf countries or the other big lenders for the crisis, but their contribution to the imbalances, which were fundamentally the fault of the United States, but it takes two to tango, those added to the crisis environment and helped to bring on the current problem. Many people say, of course, that we've got to be sure that China keeps financing the U.S. deficits. Well, you don't want any disruption thereof, and China has been enormously responsible in avoiding any inference of dumping of dollars or anything like that, and I'm sure will continue to provide responsible financing. But the imbalances themselves certainly added to the problem, and therefore it might have been better if we had had much less of those imbalances in financing in the past. So the story is mixed in terms of China's role, even within that complex of issues. On trade, China joined India in bringing the Doha round to a screeching halt back in July, when the ministerial conference in Geneva did fail, and since that time, despite recent efforts, Doha has been stalled. But I think more fundamentally, it's fair to say that China had not played an active role in promoting a positive outcome for the Doha round over its life. That's in a way peculiar. China, world's second biggest exporter, relying for growing trade surpluses and exports for its economic growth, but not stepping up to try to maintain and improve the openness of the global trading system, which is so manifestly in its interest, but did not seem to elicit the kind of policy response that would have been helpful. So even prior to the crisis, one had to raise questions, as we do in the book, about China's challenge to the global system, not only because it was big, not only because it's a great historical problem to assimilate rising powers into the global economic order, but because of its own policies in the key monetary and trade areas. Then comes the crisis, where the record, again, one would have to say is still mixed, though on balance I would say is quite positive. On the positive side, of course, China's lead position in announcing and beginning to implement a huge fiscal stimulus program from only 2 weekends ago is an enormous positive contribution to trying to lift the world out of the crisis. This is the world's fastest growing economy. It is, as I said, the major contributor to global growth in recent years, and it has undertaken an enormous policy effort to make sure that growth continues, both in China itself and in the world more broadly. Now, the headline numbers that China has put out are obviously overstated in terms of additional net contribution, and Nick will talk about that in terms of its precise parameters. But even if you cut the numbers by a half or even by 2/3, you're talking about very big injections of additional demand into the world economy to the tune of at least 2 to 3% of China's GDP for each of the next 2 years. That's exactly what the doctor ordered. That's what the U.S. clearly is now contemplating. China has taken the lead and deserves enormous credit for that. My only disappointment, in fact, is that when President Hu Jintao came to the G20 summit weekend before last, that he didn't make more of that and try to parlay that into a more international leadership position, which China certainly deserved and could take credit for in that context. President Hu apparently played it in more typical low-key fashion. I think China could actually make more of its leadership role in that context. Parenthetically, it's been the UK that's led on the financial side, whose financial rescue strategy was quickly emulated by the EU and then by Hank Paulson when he changed directions for the United States. So at this point, I would give highest marks in crisis response terms to the UK on finance, China on macro stimulus, and both deserve enormous credit for that. On the other hand, China has taken some other actions that are less helpful. Just a week or so before the G20 summit, China expanded its export subsidies on a very wide range of products. I think Nick said 300 or 3,000, which was it, Nick? 3,000 products, increased the tax rebates on exports, which are legal under the WTO. One's not suggesting here that there ought to be a new spate of countervailing duties. But for the world's largest surplus country, which is also the fastest growing country, to add to export subsidies at a time when the global economy is fast falling into worldwide recession is, to put it mildly, not a constructive step. And indeed, the fact that the G20 included a trade pledge not to erect new trade restrictions or distortions was, I think, in part a direct response to the Chinese action. In this case, I think China's actions were unhelpful. Hopefully they will not be repeated, and hopefully they do not indicate a tendency to go in a beggar-thy-neighbor direction on trade policies, again, like the United States did in the 1930s, and like a number of countries are in fact tempted to do so at the current time. The third big crisis issue is lending to beleaguered countries. Through the IMF or otherwise, it is now clear that a growing list of countries will need international help. Emerging market countries in particular will need international financing help to avoid the crisis spreading to them. Japan has offered to put up $100 billion through the IMF, maybe $200 billion in total, to help with that recycling process. China, as I indicated, as we all know, is in the best position of any country to do so, sitting on $2 trillion of reserves and well able to provide financial help of the type it's needed. Now, China, of course, if it's going to lend through the IMF, should insist that it gets a bigger voice in the IMF. That is correct and justified anyway. This would be a good time to parlay its help, its contribution, into the increased role in Chinese governance that is highly desirable and highly justified. One would hope that China would use the leverage of its lending in that direction rather than continuing to try to suppress IMF involvement in its exchange rate issue and broader surveillance questions. Again, the question is whether China will use its new clout for healthy purposes systemically or to go in other directions. But this is another area where China could establish a major leadership contribution, and one hopes it will do so. So, the bottom line, to sum all this up, China is an economic superpower. It must be part of any constructive global response, both to the current crisis and in terms of more systemic issues, whether it's global warming, that Trevor Houser will speak about shortly, whether it's the trading system, whether it's the monetary system, whether it's the current crisis. There will simply not be substantial international progress unless China is at the center of that process and plays a constructive role therein. So what's the implication for the United States? What I argue in the book is that the United States should promote that kind of outcome by reaching out to China for literally engagement as partners in what I call, partly for sensationalist reasons, a G2. I first proposed this in late 2004. Bob Zoellick picked it up, developing his leadership dialogue with the Chinese, and then Hank Paulson expanded it further in the strategic economic dialogue. Those efforts, for all their merit, and they certainly can and should be built on going forward, essentially, however, sought to bring China into the existing international system led by the United States. I think that probably just won't wash. What we need to do is work as genuine partners with China in fashioning new rules of the game in which China is in at the creation and therefore takes ownership and therefore plays a genuinely partnership role. That's, of course, easiest to do in topic areas that are new to the global order, like climate change, where there will be no international compact that means anything without China, maybe areas like sovereign wealth funds, and maybe the next big international trade initiative that succeeds the Doha round as the front runner for action in the WTO and elsewhere. When I talk about a US-China G2, I mean it to be informal, not announced, obviously not thrown in the face of other countries. Other countries, like the Europeans, like Japan on many issues, will still be absolutely crucial for implementing regime changes and structural improvements and crisis responses. The existing international institutions will have to be reformed, but they will, I think, stay largely intact in their structural terms. But the issue is to find a way in which the United States and China can work intimately together as really the core of the core to try to stimulate, structure, and then implement the kind of leadership responsibilities that I think would be hard to carry out now in any other way than by those two effectively integrating economic superpowers. That idea is now picking up adherents, as you may have noted. If you read Hank Paulson's article in the latest Foreign Affairs, his last 3 paragraphs call for a G2. He doesn't use the term, but he essentially calls for it. Niall Ferguson's new book talks about China America, and it just happened to be written up, I guess, in David Ignatius's column in the Post, or Sebastian Malaby's this morning, somebody's in the Post this morning and over the weekend. They've coined the term China America to capture the notion of the intimate interaction between China and the United States that will be necessary on an ongoing basis if constructive leadership is to occur. Whatever the term, it's clear, and our book tries to suggest that China will be at the center of the global economic system and indeed the world more broadly going forward. We try to shed light on what that means. We draw some inferences for what it implies for policy, and I'll now turn the platform over to my colleagues in order to carry the analysis further. Thank you very much.
China has been the fastest growing economy in the world over the last 30 years. I think we're well aware of that, but we're only more recently becoming aware of the fact that China is now slowing down very significantly. Its peak growth was about 12.6% in the second quarter of 2007. I think we'll hit 6% in the quarter that we're currently in. Maybe it'll be a little bit higher. So roughly China's growth has fallen by half from peak to where we are now. And this is far and away the fastest deceleration of economic growth in any time in the 30 years of economic reform in China that began in 1978. The topic of my chapter is sustaining economic growth in China, so I do have recommendations for what China needs to do going forward in terms of sustaining economic growth. But before I get to that, let me just say a little bit about why China has slowed down so rapidly over the last few quarters. First of all, of course, is the shrinkage of external demand. If we look at the first 3 quarters of this year compared to 2007, about half of the slowdown is because their external surplus is no longer growing so rapidly. In 2007, their current account surplus, net exports of goods and services, if you like that measure better, was growing by 60, 70, 80% in every quarter. In the last 3 quarters, the growth of the current account has fallen to 0. So the contribution of the external sector has declined quite significantly. On the Chinese calculation, taking into account price changes, it's fallen by about half. China is, of course, vulnerable to a further slowdown because the contribution of the external sector to China's economic growth has been very large over the last 3 years. Roughly 2.5 percentage points of economic growth has come from the expansion of their external surplus in 2005, 2006, and 2007. And so it's possible that if the global slowdown is as severe as many people now anticipate, that the decline in the external sector could subtract 2 percentage points per year from economic growth in both 2009 and 2010. In other words, it could drag growth down further quite significantly. The second reason for the slowdown is a decline in construction activity in China. In other words, a slowdown of investment that is showing up more in construction than in machinery and equipment. And this is really across the board, but it's in the real estate market, and about 70% of China's construction sector is residential real estate. And residential real estate is softening and has been softening over roughly the last year. Price growth is now slowing down, and in August, September, and October, on a month-over-month basis, prices on average were declining in China for the first time. We also see a very substantial slowdown in sales. In most major cities in China now, in the last couple of months, sales are running at 40% less than they were a year ago. So it seems like the classic kind of misperception between buyers and sellers, and the result with buyers expecting further declines in prices and thus unwilling to purchase real estate. This has been, of course, transmitted to the industrial sector. In 2007, industry grew on average at about 18%. By the middle of this year, it was running 14, 15%. And by last month, it's down to 8%. And it's largely on the basis of that very sharp decline that I think GDP growth this quarter could be as low as 6%. We have outright declines now in the production of things like steel, cement, and electric power, for example. The risk is that the softening of investment will expand from the construction into the manufacturing sector more generally because of the slowdown in export growth, which we're only in the very early stages of. And about a third of all of China's manufactured goods are exported, so if exports begin to slow down further, we'll see a decline in the more broadly in the manufacturing sector, not just those portions of it that are tied to real estate and construction. Now, what has the policy response been? China began several months ago with monetary easing, loosening of credit controls, lending quotas, lowering of reserve requirements, lowering down payment requirements on mortgages, lowering interest rates in general and on mortgages in particular. My own view is that these are not likely to be very effective in the current environment. When you have a softening of aggregate demand and price expectations or expectations for declining prices in real estate, I don't think lower interest rates are going to stimulate people to start buying houses. But more recently, we have seen a very sharp change in policy. As Fred mentioned, the stimulus program that was announced on November 9th, the headline number for the fiscal expansion is 4 trillion RMB. As Fred said, it's a little bit unclear how much of this is incremental, but a substantial portion will be. And whether it's a third or a half, I agree with what he said. This is a program that will be a very large fiscal stimulus, certainly larger than any other country with a possible exception of the United States, depending on what we ultimately do. But the other thing that has not been noticed is that the fiscal stimulus program, the headline number, only covers fixed investment. If you look at the 10-point program that came along with the fiscal stimulus announcement, it includes lots of things that we would classify as government consumption, ramping up programs on education, health, pensions, and so forth. So the whole social safety net and related areas will see apparently substantial growth, although the magnitude has not yet been outlined. In the book, I argue that China's been on the right track in terms of policy, trying to rebalance their economic growth, moving away from such heavy reliance on net exports and high level of investment, and to move towards more household private consumption expenditure as a major driver of economic growth. And certainly the prospect for increased government outlays now in the social safety net area is one that has the potential to reduce household savings and to increase household consumption and thus begin to rebalance economic growth. This has some very strong parallels with the Asian financial crisis, when China also had a fiscal stimulus program, and in that period, government consumption as a share of GDP increased by 2 to 3 percentage points of GDP. Unfortunately, since that time, government consumption has actually declined for 7 consecutive years, so I think we'll now see a turnaround with much more substantial government outlays on consumption expenditures, and that will have the potential to, of course, directly rebalance economic growth and also have the potential to encourage households to save slightly less and spend somewhat more. There are 2 areas where they have not moved, and one is what I call financial repression. That is, the real interest rates that households gain on their savings have declined very substantially over the last 5 years. We're into hugely negative numbers on demand deposits now, where the rate of return is about -4, -5. At the beginning of this year, -7 point something percent. And if you do a little counterfactual experiment and ask, how much more income would households have if they had the same real interest rates that they had in 2002, which is the base period for reasons you can read about in the paper that's in your folder. And the answer is about 6 percentage points of GDP. In other words, there's a huge, huge tax on household savings that takes the form of declining real returns. The government sets the interest rates that generate this result. It can get away with it, of course, because there are very few alternative financial assets available to household savers in China. And the result is that household income is much, much lower than it would be in a more liberalized financial environment. By liberalization here, I'm not talking about complex derivatives and securitized assets, et cetera, et cetera. I'm just talking about liberalized interest rates. China has a system where the central bank sets ceilings on the interest that banks can pay, whether it's a demand deposit, a 3-month deposit, a 6-month deposit, a 1-year deposit, a 2-year deposit, a 3-year deposit, or a 5-year deposit. In other words, complete and total control of the interest rate structure. And my view, it's really will be very difficult to get more consumption-driven growth in an environment where household real income as a share of GDP is going down, largely because interest income is going down. I would also echo what Fred said. I think they need a further appreciation of their exchange rate. Everyone talks about, and I've just mentioned how the external sector is declining contribution to economic growth, but their trade surpluses are running at records the last 3 months. Their trade surplus this year is going to be even larger than last year's. And the problem here is that the undervalued currency sends a mispricing signal to the market. It boosts up profitability in the tradable goods sector, which is mostly mostly manufacturers. And we have had, over the last 5 or 6 years, a doubling of the share of investment going into the manufacturing sector. The share of investment going into services is actually falling. And as a consequence of that, China is actually just experiencing a decline in its services share of GDP over the last 5 or 6 years. I think it's unprecedented for an economy at roughly China's level of per capita GDP growing rapidly to not have an increase in the service sector as a share of GDP. That's what China had from 1978 through the year 2000. The service share went from 20% to 40%. Since that time, it's actually gone down by about 1.5 points. So they need to allow their currency to continue to appreciate, not only to reduce the external imbalance, which would help the rebalancing, but also because it would provide better price signals into the domestic market. We'd have more investment in services. We'd have more employment generation than we have had in the very capital-intensive growth that China has experienced over the last 6 or 7 years. So let me just summarize. I think China, as I indicated, has embraced this idea of rebalancing their economic growth. This long predates the financial crisis. Indeed, it goes back to 2004. I think in some domains they have been moving too slowly. Social outlays, as already indicated, government consumption has been declining in this period, not rising. They've moved too slowly on the exchange rate, and in certain other areas, notably in the financial area, the system has become much, much more repressive than it was 5 or 6 years ago when the currency was much closer to equilibrium. So the economy is still relatively imbalanced. The global crisis provides an opportunity for China to accelerate government consumption expenditures. They've indicated they're going to do that, but we don't yet know whether the increase will be large enough to really contribute to rebalancing of the economy. And don't forget, there are two things that they're not doing, and that is financial liberalization is not on the cards. Indeed, we're still moving in the wrong direction in that area. And additional appreciation of the currency is also necessary to help rebalance the economy. And unfortunately, it looks to me like the pace of appreciation of the currency is likely to slow as we move into 2009. So a very mixed picture. I think the bottom line in terms of economic growth is I do think the stimulus could add 2 to 3 percentage points to economic growth. But remember, that's to a rapidly declining base that's now possibly as low as 6 and going lower. So I still think they will be very hard-pressed to maintain growth at the 7.5 to 8% range on an annual basis in 2009 and 2010. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Nick. And I want to thank Fred and CSIS for inviting myself and my colleague Dan Rosen to contribute a chapter to this book, which was a great pleasure. Nick laid out some of the macroeconomic imbalances, the challenges China faces, and what I'm going to do is talk about some of the energy and environmental implications of China's macroeconomic footprint. And to start, I think it's useful to look back at where, in an energy and environmental sense, China has come from. And this chart that you're looking at is an energy intensity chart, so it's mapping out how much coal, oil, and natural gas China uses for each unit of economic output. Rising line means the economy is becoming more energy intensive, and a falling line means it's becoming less energy intensive. And there's 3 significant inflections in the time that the CCP has been in power. And the first is in 1958, where Mao Zedong takes a country and moves it in a Soviet-style energy-intensive direction, so people out of farms and into steel mills. The second is in 1978, when reform begins, and China follows an economic development model laid down by other emerging Asian economies of labor-intensive light manufacturing. And over the course of 2.5 decades, you see a structural change in China's economy away from heavy industry towards light industry and services, and an improvement in the efficiency with which the economy uses energy, so that by the time we get to 2000, China accounts for about 10% of global energy demand, whereas if it had stayed at the energy intensity level that it was at in 1978, it would have accounted for about 27% of global energy demand. And sitting there in 2000, everybody looking forward, both in DC and in Beijing and at the International Energy Agency in Paris, thought that China would continue that downward trend. And instead, what we've seen over the past 5-6 years is a reversal in that. China has become more energy intensive. That little change that you see, that little flip up at the end, from 2002, when you map it out over the next 30 years, leads to a much different Chinese energy future than the one we were forecasting just 5 or 6 years ago, right? So this is the IEA's forecast out to 2030, and the dotted line for China was the forecast they made in 2002, and the darker line on top of that is the forecast from 2007, and based on just 5 years of data, the IEA upward revised its forecast for China by 79%. So that's about 2 Indias of today, or an India of 2030 is our rounding error when we think about where China's going. And that's not the result of China growing faster than anticipated, though it did grow a little faster, but it's a change in the structure of economic growth to investment-led growth that Nick talks about in his chapter, had very significant implications on the energy footprint of the country. And that was a surge in energy-intensive manufacturing, particularly cement and glass and steel. So China today is 50% of global cement production, about 36% of global steel production, 28% of global aluminum production. And that's China's current energy challenge, right? As opposed to the perception when you go to Beijing or Shanghai and see lots of shining new office buildings and streets packed with cars, that's actually not China's energy challenge today. It's energy-intensive industry, these industries in particular. And so the iron and steel sector in China alone consumes almost twice as much energy as all households in the country combined. Right? Raw chemicals production uses more energy than all private transportation, and the aluminum industry uses more energy than the commercial sector. So this is very much China's current energy challenge. The surge in these industries was to feed a surge in investment in infrastructure and buildings as China urbanized. But what's different from the current investment cycle compared to previous investment cycles in China is that China became a net importer of all of these energy-intensive, or a net exporter of these energy-intensive goods. In previous investment cycles, China had imported a lot of the steel that it needed for urbanization, and in this cycle that changed. So over 5 years, China went from being the world's largest steel importer to the world's largest steel exporter. And that change in the trade balance in energy-intensive goods explains a lot of the structural trade surplus that China's run with the world over the past few years. But it's also created very significant energy security challenges and environmental challenges. A surge in energy-intensive industry has created deep energy insecurity domestically in China, as blackouts roiled the country in 2004 and 2005, and then again this year, particularly during the Spring Festival in January, February. But those domestic energy security challenges have become global energy security challenges as blackouts and power shortages in China have fed out into global oil markets. And so what this chart maps out is the forecast for that year's energy demand growth for China made by the IEA and OPEC, made in January just for the next 12 months, forecasting the next 12 months, and then what reality was. And it's been very difficult to forecast Chinese energy demand. Now, that doesn't matter if we're talking about Sri Lanka, but if we're talking about China, which is anywhere between 15% and 60%, depending on the year, of marginal global oil demand growth, then the difference between an 11% forecast and a 4% forecast is a lot. It's like a Prudhoe Bay or a big Gulf of Mexico project, right? So there's been two key uncertainties in oil markets. It's been, will U.S. demand hold up, and will Chinese demand surprise on the upside? And what we've seen over the past 6 months is a collapse in U.S. demand taking oil prices off. What happens to Chinese oil demand over the next 5-6 years is a key question for oil security. But there's obviously environmental impacts as well, is that energy demand is met primarily by coal. 80% of China's electricity is powered by coal, 70% of its total primary energy needs. And that gives you air quality in Beijing that's pretty bad. particulate matter, SO2 concentrations that are 5 times that of your average American city, and responsible for about 300,000, 400,000 premature deaths each year, and probably upwards of $100 billion in economic loss. And of course, domestic environmental problems are related to the global environmental challenges that we face. China surpassed the U.S. last year as the largest emitter of CO2 on an annual basis. And looking forward, based on these revised forecasts of where it looks like China is going based on the past 5 years of data, it's very clear that even if the OECD closed up shop and went carbon-free tomorrow, we wouldn't be able to get to the levels of stabilization that we need to avoid catastrophic climate change, that any international climate agreement will require some level of commitment by emerging economies, China in particular. This is projected growth over a 1990 baseline for major emitting countries. But the world looks a little bit differently if you're sitting in Beijing and you're thinking about climate change. And what a Chinese climate negotiator would argue is that it's not just the CO2 that you put in the atmosphere today that matters. It's all the CO2 you put in the atmosphere over the past century, because that's still there and it's contributing as much to global warming as is what's coming out of a Chinese smokestack today. And on a cumulative basis, China only accounts for 9% of global emissions and the U.S. counts for 29%. So the view is, hey, it's your Superfund site. Why don't you clean it up? Don't ask us to split the check because we just showed up for dessert. And on a per capita basis, you've got Chinese emissions that are 4 tons compared to the U.S.'s 20 tons today. And even by 2030, will be 8 tons. I would point out here, though, that an Indian negotiating position on climate change is that we guarantee that our per capita emissions will never surpass those of a developed country. China doesn't have that luxury. By 2020, Chinese CO2 emissions will surpass Europeans based on new forecasts that just came out from the IEA. Even if China does, or if Europe does nothing, if Europe caps emissions under the third phase of the trading scheme there, which they're likely to do, that number is more like 2015. So on a per capita basis, we're actually seeing very rapid convergence between China and the developed world. But anyway, this is the challenge for international climate negotiators. This is the impasse that we're at right now, reconciling very challenging future projections of emissions from China with sticky equity issues about where the responsibility and the ability to pay lies. Now, our diagnosis of what's behind China's surge in energy demand, I think maybe offers a prescription for how we can get through these sticky international negotiations. So if you're a Chinese climate negotiator and you go to Copenhagen next December, and what's on the table from the U.S. is to agree to the same limit on emissions as developed countries, it's clearly a non-starter because with 1/5 the per capita emissions, in your mind you're condemning your farmer in Guangdong who's worked his whole life to buy an air conditioner to not turn it on while some guy in California can still buy his Hummer. What it implies is a quality of life cap at 1/5 the level of the U.S. But the good news is that right now, China's CO2 emissions don't come from poor farmers in Guangdong. They come from energy-intensive industry and a handful of energy-intensive industries, right? So the 5 that I showed previously account for nearly half of China's CO2 emissions and energy demand. And they're actually not big job creators. They altogether employ about 13 million people out of a labor force of 770 million. And they employ fewer people than they did a decade ago. So it's not for China right now a binary trade-off between environmental protection and economic growth. In fact, a lot of the policy prescriptions that Nick lays out about rebalancing economic growth would be very helpful from an energy and climate standpoint as well, and it could help us get down the road to a point where China has a higher income level and a willingness to cap emissions economy-wide. U.S. uniform commitments on emissions and Chinese commitments on key energy-intensive industries would also alleviate a lot of the competitiveness pressure that concerns people drafting climate policy in the U.S. and Europe that has to do with potential loss of competitiveness in those same key energy-intensive industries. The current financial crisis Nick mentioned provides opportunities for rebalancing for China, and I would say that that's actually true in particular for rebalancing from an energy and environmental standpoint. There's been a sharp fall-off in construction activity, as Nick mentioned, and the production of energy-intensive goods, like steel and cement that feeds that construction, has fallen off right along with it. So that electricity production in China last month was down, in fact, 5%. From the year before. Electricity demand in China is not pegged to economic growth one for one, like it is in other countries. It follows the boom-bust cycle of energy-intensive industry. Now, in previous slumps in the Chinese property sector, Chinese steel and cement producers haven't cut back production because they've been able to move into export markets and keep their lines running. Well, that external demand has dried up, and we're seeing Chinese steel and cement companies in serious distress now. And there's an opportunity as part of a response to the economic crisis to consolidate those industries, put new limits on them in terms of energy prices and environmental compliance, and move forward in a much more rebalanced way from an energy and environmental standpoint going forward. Thanks very much.
Thank you. My name is Derek Mitchell. I'm from CSIS, the International Security Program. I want to thank the Peterson folks for inviting us here today. I'm going to bring up the foreign policy and security side of things, which I know this is not necessarily the audience for that. But in essence, I want to put some of this into context, a broader context of China's foreign policy. You'll probably hear some common themes, I think, as we run between the economics and the broader foreign policy realm. I wrote the last 3 chapters, and the centerpiece is one entitled China and the World. And it's clear from that chapter that if China doesn't have a grand strategy, it is very strategic in its focus on its view of the world. And if you look at the economics as well, when China looks at itself, it doesn't look at it the way the world looks at it. The world looks at China in a macro sense. It looks at China's power. It looks at how much China has grown and developed and how much it is, how large its weight is in the world. But as it looks at itself, it sees the micro. It sees the sense that it is not as strong as others. It sees the huge challenges it faces at home, the fact of its job creation, corruption, the quality of life, the environmental stuff that we've already heard about. All of that is what China is focused on particularly. So as it looks at the world, its external policies are based on that fundamental concern about how what happens outside its country is going to affect what happens inside the country. The regime survival is not at risk, but they are extremely concerned about the impacts of what happens outside and what happens in. And the fundamental insecurity of the regime is what drives, I think, their external policies. Now, there are about 5 themes that I lay out, in essence, in my chapters that get to the heart, I think, of their foreign policy. I want to go through them very briefly. The first is a sense that they are engaged in a rather defensive posture internationally. That, again, they are preventing external developments, external actors from impacting on China or distract the leaders from their internal focus. The economic factors of opening markets, of getting access to raw materials, of facilitating trade, of investing more in the world, and building up free trade agreements, which in and of itself has both an economic but also a political aspect in building up confidence and building up good relations with other nations, of demonstrating their good faith and their desire to integrate with the world. That as well has somewhat of a defensive but reassuring aspect of Chinese foreign policy, which is critical for their desire, once again, to make sure the world outside does not focus on a challenge from China, is not concerned about China, and not focused on China as a threat. Again, rather defensive posture. They focus on win-win solutions. You hear that term all the time. I'll talk in a moment about what that means in another context as China thinks about win-win. But economic factors are a second priority as they look at the world. The third, though, even as I say they're defensive ultimately in their outlook, is they're quite opportunistic. And this is often in relation to the United States. They are there to pick up the pieces if the United States stumbles, if others, particularly the United States, stumbles. And you'll see that in Russia. I mean, the China-Russia relationship has only gotten stronger as the U.S.-Russia relationship has gotten weaker. When we stumbled in our relationship with the Philippines, we had a problem with them in Iraq. They pull out of the Philippines. Immediately, China was in there saying, what can we do with you? What can we do for you? In Latin America, there was a recent visit, as you know, of Hu Jintao as part of the APEC summit in Peru, but they've been engaged much more actively in Latin America, of course, Africa. In Burma, the United States has sought to isolate Burma for human rights reasons and China for economic but also political reasons, fills that gap. You see incident after incident where their aid policies, their trade policies, their investment, it goes where the West is not. In some regard, it's because if the West is there, they can't necessarily compete, but also they do see where the West is not, those countries, that may be left behind, and they see an opportunity to get engaged and gain some political advantage in the United Nations and elsewhere. Also, with the U.S. Having stumbled in recent days, the U.S. model, the U.S. story has taken a hit. And they, as well, I think, are responding to that to a degree. But I would agree as well that they are not being too aggressive in this. In the recent G20, of course, they did only enough for themselves and didn't take, as Fred said, a leadership role. I think that's partly because they're moving cautiously, they're treading lightly, but they also don't want, they consciously say they don't want to take a leadership role, they don't want that responsibility, but they also, I think, recognize that over time is on their side, the world recognizes the value and the strength of China. They don't need to make a big deal of it, but I think they themselves are starting to ponder how to take advantage or how not to take advantage of this, because it can have a great distracting effect for their own interest of focusing internally. So rather complex calculations going on in China at the moment. Another theme that I think runs throughout the book, in fact, is the idea that China listens and learns constantly. They are a magnet and a vacuum cleaner of international practices and learning best practices from the experiences of others. They're flexible in tactics if they are consistent in strategic goals, I would argue. And one area where they have listened and learned tremendously, and it's a theme now in Chinese outlook and foreign policy, is the principle of soft power. You hear a lot about that. Joe Nye's notion of soft power is getting a lot more attention in the United States as well as in China. But China is thinking very actively about how it can, what is its unique contribution to the world? What is it that it can provide that is unique to international thinking, international society? The United States and the West is dominated for the most part in this regard on philosophy, but China says great powers have great philosophies, have a great unique contribution to make to the world. And they are thinking about what that is for itself. Confucianism is making a rebound in China itself. It's thinking about Confucian ideas, the notion of harmony, of win-win, of confidence building. They are very concerned about their reputation. The Olympics were a key factor in this. They thought this was their coming out to the world. They were going to present themselves as a developed power, but a proud power with a great history, which I believe they did very successfully. But they ran up almost immediately following by the Melman scandals and now their economic stumbles. And the Olympics are somewhat of a distant memory. I think even in China, even as they try to be triumphant and keep the Olympics euphoria going, I think now in China they have found they are distracted tremendously. Of course, in the United States, we almost immediately turn to our domestic political conventions and our own issues at home. And you ask Americans about the Olympics, and it feels like years ago, I think. But to the Chinese, it's very immediate and very important to them for a while. But I think now the bloom is off that rose. But it was a watershed moment for modern China. It was a culmination of their 30 years of reform and opening up, a very fundamental aspect of their proud coming out to the world. And they are focused on this issue of soft power over time, of their reputation. So when the United States hits them on reputation, hits them on human rights, hits them on things that matter to them, they not only see it as an interference in their internal affairs or somehow affecting the sensibilities of 1.3 billion Chinese, as they like to say, but also a way for us to get at their soft power. So they take it very, very seriously. Now, the fifth one I talk about in the book, which again bleeds into the economics, as talked about by Fred and I believe Nick and others, is the idea of norms and rules of the international system. The Chinese say that they do not want to change the international system, but there are questions about this when they talk about the development of a new international economic order, a new international political order, and you just heard a week or two ago about the development of a new international financial order. So all this is maybe not defined precisely, but they are thinking about sort of developing world credo, a sense of developing world on the rise, the United States, as not an explicit leader of the developing world, but as they deal in economics and other realms, they are thinking about themselves as a developing world country with developing world norms and values, and this will be interesting to watch about how that plays in the development of what is likely to be, in my view, a changed international system in years to come. Now, there are, aside from some of the softer and economic focuses and defensive focuses they have. My other two chapters deal with a little bit more of the harder edge to China's development. One is military modernization. And in that chapter, which I did, by the way, with Dave Finkelstein of the Center for Naval Analyses, since 1993, they have been quite systematic, quite focused, quite strategic, and quite comprehensive in their development, in their military modernization, double-digit growth every year. I would be surprised, even with a cut in their economic growth, whether that does not persist. That double-digit would be very interesting to see, and I think a harbinger of their where they put their emphasis. This is not just about Taiwan. Traditionally, we focused we thought this was only about Taiwan, but it is not. It is altering the regional balance of power, and I think those of you who might have read recently about senior generals talking about aircraft carriers, and that is always a harbinger as well of, I think, great power status. I think it's symbolic for Chinese that great powers have certain things like space programs and aircraft carriers and the rest, and oil companies. That, and this may be sort of checking the box in essence, but I think it matters. I think they do see aircraft carriers as important, and it says something about their ambitions to be a major military player in the region, which is not terribly surprising given their size. But this requires U.S. attention because of our regional commitments. I talk a bit about that in that chapter. The final chapter, the third chapter I talk about is Taiwan specifically, and I ask the fundamental question which I realize need to be answered by not only for Americans, but frankly Chinese and Taiwanese, which is why does America care so much about Taiwan? People look at it today. Some people look at it and say, this is, Kemoe Matsu was a 1960 debate. This is a Cold War issue. Why do we still care about this island off the coast of China when we have so many huge issues that we talk about elsewhere in the book? The largest and most fundamental issues being handled by the world require U.S.-China cooperation. So why should we have this one fundamental issue there that can put us off the rails? And I talk in very systematic ways about where it comes from and why, the history of it, and extending to today. There is today, of course, some stability in that relationship, that cross-strait relationship. The tension is down, but that's an uncertain development over time. And clearly the costs of U.S. involvement with Taiwan in coming years are only going to get higher because of the requirement to work with China on everything, on the economic, financial system and development in years to come. And I'm sure China recognizes this, and they're going to want us to consider these rising costs in coming years as an opportunity for them to take advantage of. Just to conclude then, China's approach to the world overall, as I say, I think they're tactically fluid, if strategically quite focused, but there are evolving debates, another theme in this book. You'll see a full chapter talking about the debates that are ongoing in China on the whole realm of issues. And I talk about some in my chapter as well. They listen and learn. They're thinking about these things. They're debating these things. But clearly the U.S. and China have both a sense of competition as well as partnership that mark our relations. And we're going to have to walk on two legs, as the Chinese might say. We have to walk and chew gum at the same time. Our goal, I think, will be integrating China, giving them a greater role, a greater voice, as Fred discussed, in return for that issue of requiring greater responsibility in the international system. Not to be, quote, in our view, a responsible actor, but really more objective than that, taking more responsibility. They traditionally want a voice, China does, in the world, but they traditionally do not want to take the same kind of responsibility. But I sense in coming years that even though they want to keep a low profile and never claim leadership, as Deng Xiaoping famously talked about in the early 90s, and I think is still the instinct of the leadership because of their domestic issues, events may force that evolution quicker than they prefer. And I think we, as well, are going to have to bring China into that conversation. We have no choice. I expect the shape of the international system in the next 4 years. If we look at this 4 years from now, I think we'll see quite a different international system, international institutions than we see today. So with that, I'll conclude and leave to Charles to sort of wrap up and bring it all together. Thank you.
Oh, good. Ken Lieberthal is leaving, so I won't be challenged. The most important thing at this point, having taxed your attention for close to 75 minutes, is most important thing I can contribute now is brevity, so I will do that. The part of the book that I focused on really is about the part of China that I focused on in the chapters in the book that I contributed to was really looking at kind of domestic challenges to China achieving its rise to the extent that it wants to do that. And we always come back to Deng Xiaoping's quote on it doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white as long as it catches a mouse, and that's really been the prevailing political and economic ideology of China since even before he made that statement. The political ideology has been disconnected from where the society has been going for quite some time, and really the legitimacy of the party has had very little to do with its political ideology. Most of what China has done, or the Chinese Communist Party has done for the past 30 years, has been to focus on ways to maintain its power, maintain its legitimacy. And I'd argue, and I think without fear of too much contradiction, that a lot of what China has done by way of economic policy has not been about, has been largely focused on providing a basis for it to continue to catch mice and continue to be that dominant political force in China. So what's the challenge here for China? How do they go forward? How do they keep catching mice? How does the Chinese Communist Party maintain its grip on power? And I think if you've talked to Chinese officials in recent years, they talk about the need for continued 8% annual growth rates as a means of getting ahead of the unemployment situation, providing that 50,000 new jobs a day that is required to keep people from going out in the streets and protesting. Although it's been interesting the last 2 weeks as China's domestic growth projections have come down, that 8% number seems to be quoted as something like 6.5% or 7%. So I don't know whether that's them adjusting analyses or adjusting their political communications. But by and large, when they look at their challenge, they look out there and say, how do we maintain our legitimacy? How to maintain our grip on power? And as Derek said, in the old days, we tended to think of China as a bit of a monolith, and there being sort of this one set of thinking that was coming out of Beijing, the party line, and that was it. And the more that you read in China, the more it's obvious that there is a dramatic diversity of opinion in China, and that the political debates that are going on, not just among the policy geeks like me and my equivalent and our equivalent in Beijing, but among people within the party, are quite significant. And those debates are really the way that one can see where China's going politically. Clearly, they're very focused, as Derek and others have said, on the domestic political challenges that have resulted from dramatic economic growth, whether that's the disparities that have resulted in the environmental challenges that are the subject of the 80-some-odd thousand protests a year. We don't know how many protests anymore because they've stopped reporting on them, but the 80,000 plus protests, whether it's environment, whether it's a result of regional disparities, whether it's a result of income disparities, for whatever reason. And again, the Chinese Communist Party is not seized with the notion that it's about to lose power anytime soon, but it's certainly seized in the notion that they looked out at the former Soviet Union, saw the color revolutions and the like, and said, gosh, we have to do something to manage these challenges and prevent these local protests from becoming a national political movement. They are limited in their capacity to deal with that for a couple of reasons. One is that what Beijing wants is not always what happens at the local level. The dramatic reduction or decentralization that has happened over the past 30 years, financially and otherwise, has left most local officials fairly autonomous and fairly disinclined to listen to what Beijing says, as if it harms their local political interests. That is a major challenge for Beijing, and as if you look at any major or significant economic policy of China's over the last few years, a significant part of that has been directed at trying to break down local barriers and create more of a national market and reduce the autonomy and authority of local political officials versus Beijing. So the center-local issue is a major problem for Beijing in sort of fulfilling its will in the country. So those of us that have stood on the other side of the negotiating table from China and said, why won't you do this, that, or the other thing, and see our Chinese counterparts wringing their hands in despair, a lot of it is that they can't always do what we'd like them to do because local officials will ignore them. And for those of us that are planning forward and saying, well, how is Beijing going to function in this global political, economic, or other architecture that we created, or environmental architecture? How are they actually going to follow through on their commitments in climate change negotiations or otherwise, given this center-local divide? The other major challenge, and it's not a surprise to anybody that does business over there, is the corruption factor. And I will defer to those who believe that corruption is significantly worse in places like India or Nigeria, but it's certainly a problem in China. And the problem for the Chinese political leadership is that increasingly the local cadres, or broadly speaking cadres in China, younger and younger cadres are joining the party purely for rent-seeking reasons. And so while you'd like to see the party take on, more broadly speaking, the interests of the country as a whole, it increasingly looks like a lot of local, or again, younger cadres are just purely self-interested. Long term, what does Beijing want to do about all this? And I think those of us that snort when we hear in derision when we hear the notion that China wants to become a democratic country, probably should put our snorts back in our back pocket. There is a real desire, I think, from the Chinese Communist Party to become more democratic in its approach. Not again because it believes philosophically in the glories of democracy, or that they want to emulate what's going on here in D.C., but largely because they see that as a pathway to continued one-party dominance. And there's, as Derek and others were saying, there's tremendous studying of what's going on, successful and unsuccessful long-term one-party rules overseas, whether that's Japan or Mexico or even Cuba. There's a lot of studying by China on how this went on. And a strong desire over time to become, if not a pure democracy, more of an intra-party democracy. The problem for them, given the economic crisis, given the existing challenges, is democracy is a little bit like heaven. Everybody wants to get there, just not now. So I do think it will be a while before we achieve that heavenly status of democracy, inter-party or otherwise. I will close there, and I will say that I want to thank everybody here for joining. I don't know whether we're doing Q&A or not. We are. Nick is doing Q&A. He'll be standing out. We are going to do Q&A, but I did want to thank, again, the Peterson Institute for hosting us today and for the opportunity to work on a really exciting project. I want to thank some of the sponsors who are here today, and really appreciate all of your attention. Thanks very much.
Scott, yes.
Yes, Scott Ottoman with Inside U.S.-China Trade. I'm wondering if anybody on the panel would care to comment about, with the selections or the announcement today of some of President-elect Obama's economic team, what those selections portend for U.S.-China economic relations, if Geithner and Summers, in their respective positions, indicate good things for a bilateral G2 type dialogue, and if Geithner's selection would be a positive factor for arguing that an SED-like mechanism for dialogue should be retained in the Treasury Department.
It's too early to tell, Scott. I mean, I think the bottom line is anybody who actually is steeped in these issues knows it's impossible to try to take a more confrontational or combative approach to China at this point on sort of broad economic issues. So I would be very surprised if we see a dramatic departure from the current economic policy with respect to China on that front. Now, as you get deeper into the trade issues and you get deeper into the political challenge of the bilateral trade deficit or the implications of currency on U.S. manufacturing, that's where I think things start to break down. But from a macroeconomic level, there's no way that the incoming folks are going to be are going to step radically away from the current approach, in my view.
Other questions? Unless other panelists want to comment on that.
Great, let's close up. I want to thank everybody again for coming, and Nick, this is your scene, so please send us out.
Thank you for coming, and meeting is adjourned. Thank you.